Okay, so now that we've defined what an enemy is and maybe defined some specific plant enemy types, such as granivores and frugivores, let's think a little bit about what individuals can do to defend themselves against herbivory, right? So the most obvious defense, if you're an animal, is to just run away. That's what this poor zebra is trying to do. But, plants can't do this. So a lot of animal ecology actually is really focused on the responses that enemies have to predators. And it changes where they go on the landscape, it changes how they move, it changes a lot of things about animals, but plants can't do this. So plant people instead think about the way that plants defend themselves. And for the purposes of this class, I'm going to suggest that plants can defend themselves in really four main ways. They can mechanically defend themselves, chemically defend themselves. They can use indirect defenses, which are really cool. We'll talk about those in a second. And they can just tolerate the herbivory. They can have adaptations that allow them to lose tissue and still survive. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So mechanical defense, right? If you can't run away, if you're rooted in place, you could just be hard to bite, right? So the most obvious form of this is spines. Many plants have spines, and I'm sure you've encountered these plants. I've even been made to bleed from these spines before. So that's an obvious mechanical defense. But other ones that are less obvious are the leaf or shape of the plants and thickness or toughness, right? You could imagine that if you have a really thick, leathery leaf, right, it's not going to be very nice to eat. There's a reason why a lot of salad greens are the young, tender baby shoots of a plant, not the old, tougher plants. But leaf shape is often thought to also be an adaptation for herbivory. So a lot of herbivores actually have to chew in from the margins. So you can see caterpillars doing this fairly frequently. So you can imagine that these sort of complex leaf shapes might actually make it difficult for a caterpillar to kind of eat along the edge of either one of these leaves. Here they can't turn the corner, and here maybe they can't get going. And leaflets might also be important for this. You could imagine that certain herbivores might take a leaflet and leave, leaving the plant with the majority of its leaf still. So there's some evidence that that those are mechanical defenses, basically just shape of the plants. Chemical defenses, I think, are also another potentially obvious way. And if you can't run away and if you don't have any mechanical defenses, maybe a good option is to taste bad or be poisonous or toxic in some other way. So terpenes are a really common type of sort of poison that rose have. But you could also imagine things like chili peppers might be, the spiciness of chili pepper is probably an adaptation to prevent certain types of herbivory. And indeed, the chili pepper, in terms of its color and its shape and the spiciness, is actually an adaptation for birds. Birds tend to sort of swallow their food whole, and so this shape makes it really conducive for birds to swallow it, and then they don't, they're not chewing it, so they're not going to come across the spiciness. So that's kind of cool. And in fact, most of our spices that humans have used to put different flavors in our food are probably anti-herbivory chemical defenses, right? So a little bit of turmeric is nice in curry or something, but if you ate a teaspoon of curry or bit into the root of a curry plant, it would probably taste pretty terrible. You may also know that milkweed produces a latex that can actually cause cardiac problems in many types of animals. And some plant chemicals actually can get into animal brains and cause them to act crazy and potentially hurt themselves. And I always like to ask students, if they can think of any examples of this. And sometimes students can and sometimes they can't. But I'll leave it to your imagination what kinds of adaptations those might be that plants have to, get into animal brains and cause trouble. And so inside chemical defense, plant ecologists also make sort of two distinctions, which it's important for you to realize. So one is constitutive defense. The idea is that plants always produce this, it's always on. So chili peppers are always hot, right? That's just the deal with chili peppers. This is different from systemic acquired resistance, or SAR. The idea is that the attack of the enemy actually turns on the defense, right? So something like a chili pepper has a constitutive defense. It's just always spicy. But I'll give you an example of systemic acquired resistance, right? The idea is that some plants can actually tell the difference between enemies, different species of enemy, but even mechanical damage, they can sometimes tell the difference between. So let me show you a cute story that I like from the literature. So there's a plant that actually grows around Indiana. People consider it a weed, but it actually has really beautiful purple flowers. It's bittersweet nightshade. It's in the Solanaceae family with potatoes and tomatoes and tobacco. And it's commonly attacked by two different species of beetles, which are both incredibly cute if you ask me. One is the flea beetle. It's a beetle, but it looks almost exactly like a flea, and it even jumps like a flea. They're really cute. And the tortoise beetle. And there's lots of species of tortoise beetles, but you can see they have these funny shapes on their back that make them look quite a bit like a turtle. And actually, their larvae are really funny. So because bittersweet nightshade is actually has these poisonous chemicals, their larvae actually like poop all over their back. They get these little poop shields. They're really funny. And then because it basically puts all of this poison on their back and makes birds less likely to eat their larvae. Yeah, it's really funny. So if you ever see a bittersweet nightshade, look underneath the leaf and you might find these two guys. But be careful if you're too fast, the flea beetles will jump away like a flea. What's cool about this system, though, between the two herbivores and the bittersweet nightshade is that it has different chemical defense. So don't worry about what this thing is. It's just some kind of chemical defense that has this name. I don't think it matters that much that you know it. And I was actually a part of this study. Danush Viswanathan did this cool study where he basically used mechanical defense, which was a hole punch, or flea beetles, or tortoise beetles. And so what you can see is they made different amounts of this chemical when there was a control and when there were the two beetles, right? And you can see these error bars, which we now know from lab, showing us how confident we are in those values. And here's 3 more different chemicals. So you can see there's all kinds of differences, and don't worry about what these letters mean. You can see that the tortoise beetle turns on this one a little bit more. The flea beetle turns on this one a little bit more. Maybe these ones aren't actually different, which is actually what the letters are signifying. But the point is that plants adjust their defenses. And so they did this really cool experiment, and I would like you to kind of know the basic story here. They did this cool experiment where they had plants encased in little bags for 2 weeks. So for the first week, they could potentially do something different, and then in the second week, they would change the treatment, right? So in week 1, so here's what happens if you have nothing in week 1. And then in week 2, you add still nothing. It does what the nothing response is. You add flea beetles. It does the flea beetle response. You add tortoise beetle, and it doesn't do anything, right? So this is the flea beetle response. If you, in week 1, start with flea beetles and then add tortoise beetles, this plant doesn't seem to be able to switch. So it has this systemic acquired resistance to flea beetles, but it can't turn it off. Right, and you can see that if it is attacked by a tortoise beetle first and then a flea beetle, it turns on the tortoise beetle defense and it can't turn that off. So when flea beetles come later, it can't protect itself. Right, so you can see whenever the flea beetle came first, it turned on the flea beetle defense. If the flea beetle came second after nothing, it still turned it on. But if the flea beetle came second after a tortoise, it couldn't defend itself. Right, and this means that this is going to have consequences for the herbivore at the sort of population level. So here's one of these bags where we could like dump herbivores in the top and then tie it back closed. And we could set up different populations. So you could set up a population that had been attacked by flea beetles first. So everyone would have the flea beetle defense that it is stuck with for the whole growing season. We could do the same for the tortoise beetle. We tie up a population of plants where they all have the tortoise beetle defense and they can't turn it off. We could do the mechanical defense, which doesn't do anything. Or we can make mixed populations where some plants have nothing and some plants have flea beetle defenses and some plants have tortoise beetle defenses. And then the question was, what are the consequences for the herbivore populations? You could imagine or hypothesize that this population would be susceptible to tortoise beetles, while this population would be susceptible to flea beetles because they have the wrong defense. And in fact, that's what happens. So just a quick one. If we look at the flea beetle defended plants, you can see that flea beetle defense does not stop tortoise beetles. So these square ones, these were the plants that we had primed with the flea beetle damage. You can see they have way more, almost twice as many tortoise beetles attacking them as the ones that had the tortoise beetle defense. And you can see this is wrapping down. That's just the plants getting ready for winter, which we would expect. Cool, so that's mechanical defenses and chemical defenses. I want to talk now about indirect defenses, the third form of individual level defense. So the reason it's called indirect, right, is that mechanical and chemical defenses that we just talked about are clearly direct. The plants are directly forming those defenses. It's up to the plant to do it. The indirect defenses are when the plant actually attracts defense from outside. Therefore, it's not directly caused by the plant, or it's indirect. Right? So here's an example in tomato where if you damage a plant leaf, and you've probably smelled this, right? If you break a tomato leaf, they really smell a lot. Or a mint leaf, if you break a mint leaf, you can really smell the mint more than if you don't break it. So if you damage a tomato plant, it releases a bunch of volatile compounds. And a lot of plants do this because they're literally trying to call in an airstrike. And so there's all this cool studies where plants that are damaged can potentially attract parasitic wasps to come in and eat the herbivores. So if you don't have a mechanical damage and you don't have a chemical defense, well, let's just trick animals into protecting us for it. So everybody wins, right? We call in this predator, the predator eats the herbivores, the plant wins, the predator wins. I guess the herbivore loses. Now plants can actually do this, so they call it an airstrike. So here's just an example of how it works, kind of tied to the way Mike and Damon would think about it. The caterpillar damages it. We get some signals that go off in the plant that leads to a volatile emission, volatile in the sense that it goes off in the air and you can potentially smell it. It attracts often parasitic wasps, parasitoid wasps, who then block the herbivore defense. It's a really nice, I think it's a really cool game. You could imagine how this is very much a 3-player game where the strategy of the herbivore and the plant and the predator are all shaping how they interact. And plants can do it below ground too. So here's an example where maize, corn, is actually able to recruit nematodes to protect its roots, right? So again, you could take a look at the roots and the leaves that have been induced by the damage of herbivory. So again, this is just some kind of chemical defense that I don't want you to worry about, but you can see that when the plants are damaged by an herbivore, they turn on this chemical. So it's a systemic acquired resistance. Then what they did was they could put nematodes into the middle of this crazy pot that they built. So the nematodes then would be able to swim up the arms towards the different plants or to control locations. And they could basically see, okay, well, do the nematodes go towards induced plants? Do they go towards non-induced control plants? Do they go towards the arm if we just inject the chemical that we know is being induced? And basically, this is what they find, that when they are induced, the nematodes swim towards the induced plants to basically protect their root systems. They could artificially induce this. Just by injecting the same chemical here into this arm. And that this was significantly different from any of the controls. And healthy plants actually attracted some number of nematodes as well. But empty, they significantly didn't go to these empty tubes if there was nothing injected into them. So this is a pretty sophisticated kind of plant behavior almost. How do plants do it? Usually they do it by sensing some chemical produced by the attacker. Plants have receptor proteins. They're similar to photoreceptors, but they sense chemicals, transduce the signal into some gene expression within the plant. So, you don't need to know this, but here's an example, right? So, here's a bunch of different herbivores that either lay eggs or chew or whatever the plants do, and you can see that the point of this figure is just to show you that they turn on completely different sets of genes. Somehow the plants are able to sense something about these plants, and it turns on completely different genetic responses, which is, I think, really cool. Pathogens can do this too, where they basically with different kind of receptor proteins, plants are able to sense how they're being damaged. And effectors are proteins that attempt to, these enemies often have effector proteins. They're proteins that attempt to short circuit the plant's gene expression and physiology. So they try to trick the plants into doing something different. All right, so then the last and maybe most boring or interesting, depending on your perspective, is that plants can simply tolerate herbivory, right? So if you can't stop herbivory, maybe it's useful to have tools that let you recover from herbivory. In other words, to just tolerate it. And there's lots of things you could probably think about, right? You could have increased photosynthetic rates, maybe ramp up your ability to gather carbon, right? So if you think of that game, that would be like instead of getting 2 carbon per turn, maybe you could make your leaf have more photosynthetic machinery so you could get 3 or 4 carbon per turn. And this would allow you to grow back following the attack. Plants also have changes in development or allocation, right? So you could imagine if you were playing that board game and you had 5 leaves and I suddenly took 3 away from you, you would probably start adding more leaves before you would start adding other parts of your body, right? And so that's exactly what plants can do. And this increased growth is often called compensatory growth. And it's just this extra growth that plants can have following attack. And so the way to think of it is that imagine if you made 5 leaves, I took away 3, and then you grew back 3 more. Your whole life, you would have actually had 8 leaves, right? And that's the idea of this compensatory growth, the fact that you've made more leaves than you would have made in the absence of being attacked. Yeah, and so plants will often grow back more tissue than they had before as a way of compensating for the losses of herbivory. And so just a little self-plug, I've actually made a game, a continuous game of this compensatory growth effect by plants. So we found the evolutionarily stable strategy. And I actually want to point out that Wesley Evans was a botany major. So he did Botany 498 with me. It was a research project. This experiment was really fun. I thought it was funny. It was basically Wesley versus the plants. So Wesley was sort of playing a game with the plants. He would simulate herbivory on wheat by using scissors. And yeah, Wesley and I were able to publish this paper. So this is something that if you're a botany major, a lot of classes require you to do a research project, and sometimes we're able to publish those with the undergraduates. So what we did here is this log response ratio, which you saw in lab, which is meant to be an index of plasticity, right? So just like in lab, in the plasticity lab, we could compare damaged to undamaged control plants, and depending on how this went, if it went bigger or lower, we could look at, we could basically call this compensatory growth. And so what the model was able to do was say this red line is what we would expect if the plants were just getting smaller as we cut them up, and that the model predicted this extra growth, this extra compensatory growth, and in fact that's actually what the plants did. So they significantly grew more, and this gray line are like the standard deviations that you're seeing in lab, so that the plants significantly did more growth than we would have expected if we were just chopping them up. Yeah, there you go. No attack. Wes attacking with scissors is the blue line. So, not surprisingly, I'm probably going to show you a matrix game now, but I think I'm going to stop this video here, and we'll leave that for the next part.